Her steps carried her at a slow, unsteady gait up the steps, dragging her good shoulder along the splintering wood for support. At the top, she found herself on a wide platform facing a thin wall that rose up to meet the peaked roof, and a plain door set in the wall. The sound was coming from there. Twilight stepped forward, then glowered at the door, face slack in exhaustion. Finally, she let herself in. The steady creak and groan of the wood echoed in the empty room, bouncing off the slanted beams of the ceiling. After every creak came with the thump, a rolling soft beat of timber above upon timber. Twilight squinted, trying to see into the darkness. The room was like a tunnel stretching into a vast distance, and at the far end she could just see what appeared to be a square window or door opening into blinding sunlight. And in between her and the opening, a spindly, shadowy shape rocked backwards and forwards, its back to Twilight, every detail washed out by the light shining behind it. "You struggle so hard, Twilight girl," a voice came, higher and scratchier than Applejack's. "Wearing yourself out, that's fine, if you want it in that way. The field that never tires, the field awaits for you always." "So you've learned the riddles?" Twilight asked, said through her gritted teeth. Her voice husked of what it used to be. "Should I be impressed? Or should I ask you why you've decided to look like Granny Smith this time? Would it get me anywhere?" The chair froze, as if nailed suddenly in place. "There are other shapes in your mind that you could grow," came a voice, young and airy and bright, "if you wanted them here." "What does that mean?" Twilight asked. "You're saying I have some sort of control over this?" She eyed at the pale light beyond Granny, not really interested in what the impostor had to say. It seemed stronger now, more incoherent than ever. But as far as she was concerned, that only meant that there was more dangerous, now more capable of luring her. She was hurt and sick, but if she could summon the strength for a run, if she could get past the high chair before the figure within the chance had to react. A low, waily thump rolled through the room, or perhaps beneath it. It seemed to vibrate on the wooden path Twilight's hooves. It was almost sounded like an instant, as if the air on the ground themselves had laughed at her. "You affect the field," Granny said, "and the field affects you. There ain't no control or making things here, so here." A pair of hooves settled onto the armrests, muscles stiffening beneath the smooth and supple coat that they had pushed to a figure up and out of the chair. Granny turned, and Twilight saw it was Granny, and yet delicately not Granny. This scarecrow, this doll, had been made to resemble Granny as Twilight might have imagined it. She looked into the prime of her youth, and while white hair was now a platinum blonde, almost incandescent into the radiance of the instant doorway. Her once loose skin had tightened over her face into a coy, cocky sort of smirk. Strangest of all, she had eyes, all eyes that sparkled with cool, sharp light of glass that they caught in the daylight beyond, lending a sickening and simulacrum of life that pulled onto the face. But below the veneer, Twilight could still sense a dark, lurking pressure. She had felt it in the crude hollows of the false Applejack. A ruthless, wicked hunger, a sense of deadly, insustainable, and immeasurable need. She could feel the weight of its regard, a pitiless interest that seemed to reach out to Twilight and pulled at her, as if coaxing towards the scarecrow with a faint but a terrible gravity. "I don't understand," Twilight said, taking the unconscious step back, and her eyes flickered between the door and behind her, a door that led nowhere, the light beyond. The doll was like Granny Smith, only shrugged, and a gesture so mild and fluid that it just made Twilight's skin crawl. When she spoke, her little mouth opened and flexed, but the motions never quite seemed to match the words. Maybe if you don't, 'tain't no matter either way. You barely knew anything about the other place, and you got along here just fine. Why should it matter there? What is here? Twilight snapped. She stamped her hoof and then toppled and fell over onto her knees, her weaker leg unable to support her. Why did you bring us here? She asked, hissing as she gripped her shoulder. S is the field, Twilight girl, Granny said, chuckled a firm, high laugh, like if she was telling a little private joke to a friend behind the schoolhouse. The roots of every field, the wellspring of life, and the final bed of every flower, the loam at the heart of the world, and the crack in the mountains, through which spring pours. This is every field, everywhere. You're a smart filly. You should know about this. Twilight scoffed, cradling her throbbing leg as it pained. Hot tears washed from the dust of her face. I don't have a clue what you're babbling about, she spoke. The fragment of memory sparked somewhere in the back of her recesses of her muddled thoughts. A lecture from Celestia's on the nature of shape and transformation. Something about notion of true forms, absolute ideals, or even original manifestations that lay beneath the perceptions of matter and motion. But whatever it all meant, they weren't the answers she needed. Why don't you let us go? Twilight whimpered. What could you possibly have to regain from all this? As suddenly as it appeared, the smile vanished from Granny's face. The sensation, the pressure from the vastness deep below her eyes intensified. She took a slow few almost delicate steps towards Twilight, as though sliding up shyly towards her. If in were her place to leave, the way would be simple, Granny said. Just put your hooves to the path and follow it home to your doorstep. But I think you'll find it won't work that way for you. You stay away from me, Twilight growled, her horns sparkling, or I'll do to you what I did to that thing out in the field. To her dismay, though, the light from her magic doesn't seem to faze Granny even in the slightness. It barely even reflected in her eyes, a dim glow that flared only briefly before sinking into intensifying and deepening darkness. Granny took a few steps closer. You can burn a branch, Granny said, head quietly. You can burn a forest, but you can't burn the roots, Twilight girl. Haven't you seen by now? You ain't killed with what it feeds. What? Twilight swallowed. What does that even mean? What feeds? Finally, Granny paused again, looking down at Twilight with a momentary puzzlement. Then her head tilted back and she gave a strange, rattling sigh that sounded downright exultant. Why, everything, Twilight girl. Every creature from the littlest mouse to the tallest tree has the stuff of it on the field in it, and it all return again, give and take, grow and die, to become the flourishing and the decay of the flourishing again of what comes after, and then return to your embrace once more. Our embrace? Twilight asked. You mean you and that thing that looked like Applejack? Just what are you anyway? Granny lowered her face again, mouth quirked with the expression of mild disgust, as though she had just decided that she was talking to an idiot. I told you, Twilight girl, we're the field. The slats creaked and flexed beneath Twilight, and for a moment she thought the barn was moving, stretching beneath her and around her like a cat beginning to wake up. She then realized the floor had bent beneath a new weight, and she turned to see what there were ponies beginning to enter the room. No, not ponies. She realized as the blood in her veins turned cold, the faceless figures of her friends, of the Apple family, the little diminutive doll shapes of Spike, filed slowly through the room one by one, shuffling and dragging their stubby soft feet across the floor. They each took a different path, following slow and seemingly at random turns as they fanned out across the room, managing to form of a line, hemming Twilight away from the door. None of them looked at her, their heads limp and lolling, as if though they were being pulled by invisible strings from the ceiling. "We are the field, and the field is us," Granny said. "All one and the same." The scarecrows shuffled closer, still looking everywhere, but where they were going. Twilight pushed herself against the wall, holding her hoof over her shoulder as it ached and throbbed. "What about Applejack?" Twilight asked desperately. "My Applejack, where is she? Why are you doing this? What did we even do to you?" "Applejack's in the field," Granny said, gesturing to the square of the radiant sunlight beyond the opening, where she needed to be. "Where you belong, Twilight girl." "I don't belong here," Twilight growled. Her eyes darted from around the room again, searching, calculating, shifting herself to keep the distance between herself, Granny, and the others as balanced as she could. Her gaze settled lastly on the sunlit portal one last time before returning to Granny. "I belong at home, with my friends, with Applejack. Give her back, or swear to Celestia." "You belong here," Granny cut her off, and her face warped into a furious scowl. "You've taken from the field, Twilight. You've taken her nourishment, fed your bones with her remains. Why have you taken today? Taken so much of what we have to give?" Her expression softened again, and she stepped closer. Twilight realized the fabric face and the false eyes were weeping somehow. Tears were shining on the cold glass and soaking gently into the soft skin. "But you're able to give in too. We have felt it from afar. So long ago, the light that burns in you. A heat brighter and stronger than 100 of your kin, and 1,000 of years of the sun's provender. It strengthened us both, brought us closer to you, and we've grown and grown, stretched our roots out to find you, and return you here at last, to become ours." The faces of the scarecrows lifted, turning faceless eyes up in slow unison to fix their gazes on Twilight, softly like peeling the skin from a fruit. The stitches of fur from their mouths popped and spread, splinters of wooden teeth sprouting from the infinite blackness of their jaws. Straw whispered as if something moved closer, inch by inch, almost as though wary of startling her. Granny Smith edged closer too, smiling gently at Twilight. "And you hold such abundance as well," she whispered, "so much deeper than the others. More even than the strongest of your kind. Even more than when we first felt you reached out to us. How could that be? No matter what, you need to feed the field, Twilight girl." "What?" Twilight swallowed, glancing briefly at the figures of her friends, now clustered within the wing's reach of her back. She leaned closer to Granny, just looking for an instant to those cold, hungry eyes, into the depths of what seemed to be the limitless chasm yawning open before her hooves. "What does that mean, Granny?" Granny's face settled into a smug, satisfied with contentment. She appeared almost lazy, and closed the distance between herself and Twilight with a few casual sashaying steps. "Even just one pony," she said gently, "return to us, keeps the fields rising and falling with every generation. But you..." Something broke in Granny's voice then. The snapping crisp of a sprig of straw, a wheezing rattle entered it, and beneath it, something sharp and cruel and hungry. Tiny shards of wood began to sprout from her lips as she said, "You will nourish our roots for the seasons beyond count. It's time, Twilight girl. It's time to..." Twilight's hoof flashed out, striking Granny square on the muzzle. The scarecrow emitted a howling moan, muffled by the implosion of its face around Twilight's hoof. But before Twilight could make another move, the rest of Granny's face collapsed around her leg, and then she felt shards of jagged wood rip into her ankle from her sides. Twilight screamed, reflectively trying to pull her leg back, and felt the splinters hook deeper in response. Behind her, she felt the stubs of soft limbs wrapping around her hind legs, her barrel, and her wings. Twilight thrashed her horn, igniting and swizzing a wire of flame that erupted around her, spiraling like a whip, and it snapped and lashed around her. Granny howled, scorch marks appearing on her face as she fell back away. Twilight lurched into her hooves, hearing the heavy thuds of sack-like bodies trembling around her, and didn't waste another moment. She ran, and as Granny Doll flung itself up in front of her, burying its splintered teeth into the deranged grin, Twilight lashed out with the final sputtering of fragment from the whip. Granny's left foreleg fell from her body with a thud so gentle it was nearly a sigh. Something soft and glistening poured from its limp form, and clods of luscious soil spilled all over the floor as lights like hundreds of tiny eyes danced within its moist depths. Granny howled, falling to her back once more, and lie thrashing on the ground. Twilight leapt into the air, stamping down on all four hooves on Granny's body before sprinting back over her and galloping towards the light. She hurtled down the passage. She turned to look at her shoulder, fearing at any moment she felt this grip of fabric hooves and splintering cuttings. She had startled to see what the scarecrows simply stood while she'd left them, lined up with almost as if the family photo, with the legless Granny sitting motionlessly at her fore. They watched her go in the dark, leering grins, none of them moving so much as an inch, except the Spike Doll, which raised one little claw and waved mockingly to her. The floor vanished from beneath Twilight, and she found herself flailing at the empty space. She yelped, feeling her body pitch forward, and then she tumbled head and over hooves into the searing light of day. The heat from the sun struck her as if from an open oven, and baked golden ground rushed up to meet her. Twilight felt a single percussive punch from her gut as she slammed into the ground, slammed to her, and her body crumpled into the dust amid the dry, splintering corn stalks. How long she lay there, she couldn't have said. She had little doubts that she lost consciousness once or twice, but if she did, she would have no way to mark it. The sun didn't move, and the plants stood motionless as stone. The farmhouse was gone, if it were ever truly been there. The only signs of life were the little waves of dust that puffed up in front of Twilight's eyes, driven by her wheezing breaths. Even the cicadas were gone. A minute, an eternity. Twilight twitched, forced into movement by the cramps of her clenching, battered stomach. She rolled, grimacing at every movement and every contact with the ground, until she could lift her head and look around. The plants were so utterly dead she could practically see through them now, withered and dried up into the thinnest of sticks. They had gone gray, and their leaves were shriveled into wisps of no thicker than a vein. They sprouted from the ground that was hard as bricks, caked in layers of sand as fine as sawdust. Twilight coughed and scuffed it and hoofed in it, not knowing what she was looking for. The loam at the heart of the world. Twilight didn't give a thought of what changes to might signify her more. Her faculties of reason and intuition had failed her, and now it felt as if though her brain itself was shutting down, leaving her with nothing but her senses and her dimmest instincts. And with that little awareness that she had remaining, she noticed that she was only a few rows from the path, a simple straight track leading from left to right, which had turned in different directions just down the way. What was left, except to follow her eyes and her hooves? Twilight stood, the pain seemingly to recede as she stepped into the road. She didn't feel her muscles exerting, didn't feel her own body as it sweated and bled. She just started walking. She walked and walked. The maze had led on and on. She followed its turns unthinkingly, never choosing which way to go when a branch is presented, following either at the random or in some deeper sense she could no longer understand. She gave no thought of the magic nor to flight, and her teleportations had failed. Her strength was gone, and she could only see pain through the dead and gray cracks in the world surrounding her. When she passed by the white sand bones lying stretched out in the center of the path, one leg arched out before its final scraping, eternal gasp. She paid it to mind. She barely noticed the ribs and spine and skull still draped over the leaf-dry shawl of skin that once clung to so possessively to them, or the brown bald head out of the sunflower that had bloomed and faded between its shoulders. One brittle joint snapped as she stepped upon it in passing, and when the husk of the circular straw dropped away from above its horn, she didn't notice until it rolled away. She followed the left hoof path, is reaching the leg pointed towards without even knowing why, and when she had left it behind, there was nothing in the field once more. There was nothing, and there would be nothing. Set your hooves on the path and follow it to your doorstep. Twilight kept walking. At some point, Twilight stopped walking when that happened. She crawled, pulling herself along the ground while protecting her raw skin as much as she could. Eventually she stopped crawling too. On the field she lay, foreleg draped over her side, panting in hot, shallow gasp. Her belly had stopped hurting some time ago, and there was only what felt like a light of a little hollow there, and a hole in the center of her that only held the air in her lungs. Somehow Twilight found herself standing up again. As she took a few steps, tripped and fell, rose and walked a little farther. Another bend in the maze met her. Just a few steps, she thought. Look at the view, a little more distant. Then the Jesse's dead rose. Long wide path, one that led to the horizon. That would be nice. It would be nice not to turn anymore, just to follow one easy line to the sky with her eyes, if not her hooves. Twilight rounded the bend and raised her head. A gray wall just met her just a few steps ahead, blocking her every path. She had reached a dead end. Twilight groaned and sat. Her back collapsed from under her and spent spiraling all to the dirt once more. She had come so close. She was sure of it. Just a little farther, and there would be answers, or options, or something. Anything. Twilight closed her eyes. The sound of distant laughter aroused her from whatever stupor had claimed her. A light flooded into her mind as the slightest gap appeared in her eyelids, curiosity compelling her one more time to see, to investigate what was happening around her. The dead end was just before her, but beyond it, through the dried sticks and drooping threads of the plants, Twilight could see a clearing. A spread wide of space of rich brown soil opened up beyond the cornfield. It was crowded with ponies. Foals were running between the stands, playing games, sharing and stealing sweets as their laughter filled the sky. She could see Granny Smith leading on the walker, talking and pointing admittedly at the different areas of the farm, while Big Mac nodded and Brayburn an instant listened gravely. It was Sweet Apple Acres. It was just a few steps away, a trot through less than a half a dozen stems that thin that a carriage could have driven between them. It was home. Twilight heard the faint distant thumps of hooves stepping heavily on the ground somewhere close to her. Some pony was walking through the field close by. She could hear them pause, meander in any way some distant direction, then approach again. Coming so close to see, she thought she could feel the ground shake just beneath her head. She turned, blinking into the colorless sky. Applejack stood above her, looking down on Twilight with a slight, curious tilt her head. The hot white blaze on the sun burned down over the edge of her soft brown hat, casting her a shadow, yet even so, Twilight could see the gentle, affectionate smile on Applejack's face and the warm, bright shine of her emerald eyes. "Applejack?" Twilight croaked, feeling her lips crack when they broke into a relieved smile of her own. "I found you!" Applejack knelt down, sinking to her knees above Twilight. "You sure did, Sugar Cube. You sure did." "I didn't think..." Twilight's words snagged in through the tough brambles of her dry throat, or as she swallowed painfully, feeling as if though she had eaten sandpaper. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again, or anyone. What, Applejack, is this? Are you real?" "Shh." Applejack leaned closer and reached out to Twilight. Her smile was as kind and soothing as a mother's for a moment. Twilight wondered why Applejack looked so well, so healthy, when she had been wandering for at least as long as Twilight. Applejack touched Twilight's cheek and stroked it gently in her hoof and felt rough and scratchy. It was the dust, Twilight thought, the dust and blood and grime, which Applejack now brushed away. Everything's fine now, Sugar Cube. Twilight sagged in relief, nuzzling gently into Applejack's touch. Then her eyes snapped wide as she felt the pointed, splintery tip of the stake slide into her neck, just below jutting of the jawbone. Flesh snagged and tore, dragging against the dry wood, jutting from Applejack's leg. Somewhere deep in Twilight's throat, she felt something tug and stretch, like the last lingering root of a baby tooth, before it was severed with the faintest pop. Twilight opened her mouth and filled with thick, bubbling warmth. She coughed and spat and then sputtered and splat again, but her words remained submerged beneath the rising tide coating her tongue. "It's time to join the field, Twilight," Applejack whispered lovingly. Bits of straw and soil dropped from her mouth as she bent down, casting Twilight's body entirely into shadow. The stake crunched beneath the ground of Twilight's head as she twitched and writhed, pinned in place. Instead of coarser dirt, she suddenly felt herself limbs churning through the thick, warm mud that coated her fur and turned very sticky and heavy where the water had come from. Twilight wondered weakly. "It's time to feed the field," Applejack said, bent her face to meet Twilight's. The dusty, sun-scorched pony limped forward, rounding the turn of the field without taking another moment's notice of it. There was nothing but the field, nothing but the path and the sun and the sky. Walking took her from the field, and walking brought her to the field. She had no thought for anything else, no memory for whatever there had been anything else, and when she took that final turn out from among the desiccated stalks, stepping out into the gray clearing of the cold winter morning, she looked around in puzzlement at the place where there was no corn but buildings, a barn as well as a house and a mill. She didn't recognize any of it. Nothing like this should exist in the field. She felt nothing when she felt the strange little yellow pony froze in shock, staring at her through as it had been dead to the rise. She also took notice when that filly, screaming strange words like Granny and Big Mac, bolted into the house, then came charging back towards her, another strange ponies in tow. In the months that followed, the pony's memories gently returned, carried her into the currents of dreams of each night while she slept. She remembered she was Applejack. She recalled the names of her family and the names of her friends. She remembered Twilight Sparkle, the strange, bookish, determined pony who always had to come from Canterlot to become such a fixture in her life, and then just then, as suddenly it walked out of it again, without saying a goodbye. She learned that the farm had prospered in 3 years of absence, in that spite of the family's crushing grief. The crops had grown and blossomed like never before, not almost without the need of apples to tend to them at all, and not just from the farm, but from the gardens of Carrot Top, Roseluck, and Green Bean and Spring Onion, from the orchards of Appaloosa, of one of the oranges out to the east, and vineyards of the grape cousins to the west. All of Equestria had seemed to have come overflow with bounty. She never remembered the day the harvest festival, never remembered going into the corn maze to search for Pipsqueak, and never remembered what had happened between them then and when she had come wandering back out of the field. She had never heard the search of parties, never seen any of the ponies that had combined through the forest and farm day in and out of search for her and her friend. She could never answer the question what had happened, even to herself. All she knew were the words Granny in shining armor and Nurse Redheart told her that she had when she first answered that day on a return. When were their princesses, whose name she actually remembered was Celestia? All had asked desperately, "Where is Twilight? Do you know what happened to Twilight?" All she knew was what they told her and what she had answered, eyes blank and staring into some place far away. "Twilight's in the field. That's where she is. That's where she's meant to be. She's in the field. She's in the field." What's up, my pretties? it's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, please stay pretty.